What's up, everybody? This is Mario, and I'm back with another episode of Endurify. And I wanted to follow up today and build on what we talked about yesterday. So, yesterday, I gave you a scenario about training. So, you have signed up for a half Ironman in 2021. You've been training for 5 months. You've told family, friends, coworkers about it. They're all asking you, how is training going? How are you feeling? Are you feeling excited? And then 2 weeks before the race, you start to feel a sharp pain on the outside of your knee when you run. And it's gotten so bad that you go to see the doctor. And you have your doctor's appointment, and she says that you need to stop running for 3 to 4 weeks and that you shouldn't do this race. So how would you respond to that? What we talked about yesterday was that some athletes respond with a grief response. And we talked about the 5 different stages of grief and what are some practical strategies to deal with each of those. And while that's important to discuss and to know about, according to the authors of The Brave Athlete, it really only impacts about 10% of the athletes that they have worked with. And it's usually with traumatic injuries. So that kind of made me think, well, why do some athletes take everything in stride, whereas others respond with this grief response? And that is what I want to talk about today. And one of the things that I learned from this book is this term of cognitive appraisal. And cognitive appraisal is just a fancy way of saying that your reaction to your injury depends on what the injury means to you. Okay, so it's kind of like simple, right, when you think about it that way, but appraisal means to assess something. And so when you get injured, that injury is simply a stressor. And the injury itself is largely insignificant. It's really all about how do we think and feel about the injury that is the real difference. And so it's not necessarily what happens, it's how we perceive what happens to us. And I think that is so true in sports, but it's also even more true in life, where so many times we build up these different stories that we tell ourselves about the things that are happening in our lives. And that can be a powerful story, or it can be a negative story, and it can be something that tears us down. And so the crazy thing that I learned from reading this book and reading this chapter is it's important to train yourself to manage this appraisal process, because the appraisal process not only determines how well you cope with the injury itself, but also the likelihood of you getting injured again. So think about that. It's basically saying the way that you perceive your injury has a huge factor on the chances of you getting re-injured again. So to go into that a little bit more, what they talk about is the risk of re-injury is partially determined by your history of coping with injuries that you've had in the past. And they're not 100% sure why, but when you respond negatively to injuries, it has been shown to decrease confidence, change your movement biomechanics, maybe the way that you run or you walk or you jump, and it negatively impacts decision making. And all of those 3 things, the decreased confidence, the changing of the movement biomechanics, and the negative impact on decision makings, are risk factors for re-injury. So this process that we're talking about of cognitive appraisal and kind of assessing what does an injury mean to you is super important for you to understand and for me to practice, because this has a big impact on your chances of getting re-injured, which clearly nobody wants to get injured, and nobody wants to get re-injured and have that become something that could be debilitating. So now that we understand why that's important, let's talk about how that appraisal process works and what are some strategies to deal with it. So the appraisal or assessment process happens in a 2-step process, and there's a primary and a secondary. And the primary appraisal process involves your professor and your chimp brains kind of arguing about what's at stake. They argue about how threatening or harmful the injury is to your physical and psychological future. It starts to focus on what you've lost or what you will miss out on, and the level of disruption that this injury might cause. So These are really the thoughts and feelings that you have about the injury itself. What does the injury mean? And like we've talked about, the professor is that logical, facts-based part of your brain, and the chimp brain is that ancient part of the brain that is very emotional, very quick, and is out there to really protect your safety. And this is where it causes that potential stress, frustration, depression, grief, anger. This primary process is where those things happen. Then the secondary appraisal process, that involves your ability to cope with the implications of the injury. So it's basically your physical and psychological ability to deal with what lies ahead. So the primary process is the thoughts and feelings you have about the actual injury. And then the secondary part is, what are the implications of that injury, and how do you feel about your ability to cope with those scenarios that are going to present themselves? And if you are an athlete that doesn't cope well with injury, it basically means that your primary and your secondary appraisal mechanisms are plagued by what the authors call gremlins, which impact your ability to act rationally and logically, which is what we all want to do. So what I want to get into next are just 3 gremlins that you may have if you don't cope well with injury in the primary appraisal process, and then what are some solutions for it. So the first gremlin, or the first problem that might present itself in your primary appraisal process, is not knowing what's wrong with you. So if you can't answer basic questions about your injury, that's the first problem. Because when you don't have medical answers to what's going on to you, that's where our mind starts going to the worst case scenario, and you start looking online at all of these stories of people who had these horrific injuries, and it's just not a good place to start. So what you need to do is you need to seek medical advice to diagnose your injury correctly. You need to get that medical diagnosis of what's causing the pain. And the other thing that you need to do is you need to focus on fact-finding behavior. So like I mentioned, when the mind doesn't know what's going on, it just goes to those worst case scenarios. So that's where the fact-finding behavior and the medical advice and the medical diagnosis can help solve this problem and get rid of this gremlin that's plaguing you. So the second gremlin that they talked about in the book is what they call delusion funnels and tipping points. And so this is all about the pre-injury experience, because injuries are almost always accompanied by warning signs like tightness or discomfort in your training. And in those moments where you become aware of it, a lot of times you downplay, you might ignore, or you might rationalize it away. And the authors call this a delusion funnel because it leads you to one direction, and that's injury. And so I think we've talked about this, but most of the injuries that endurance athletes have are from overuse injuries. And in those overuse injuries, that's where you're going to, if you're working out on a daily basis or even on your off days, you may feel like certain tightness in your knees or your back or your feet. And you really need to pay attention to those trigger points so that you can be proactive about dealing with your injury rather than have to react to something that happens. So the solution here that they talk about is keeping a journal of issues, tightness, and unusual thoughts or feelings that accompany your training. And then write that down and try and review those journals. Try and share your observations with your coach. And really the purpose of all of this is to try and recognize and call out those warning signs that may happen and that may come up so that you can proactively address them. So that's the second gremlin, the delusion funnels and tipping points. And then the third gremlin is catastrophizing and thinking that everything is ruined. And this is when you believe that things are way worse than what they actually are. And this is where you might believe that things are no longer possible in the future, and like this is the end, right? This might be the end of your career. This might be the end of your season. This might be time for you to switch sports. It's all of those just super dramatic negative thoughts. And so the solution here, according to the authors, is to change the shitty self-talk that by confronting it with meaningful and factually substantiated evidence. So it's kind of similar to what we talked about in the beginning, where when you don't have all of the information, your mind goes to the worst possible scenarios, and you need to really focus on fact-finding behavior. This is the exact same way. You really want to find substantial evidence. And one of the practical ways that they recommend that you can go about doing this is to get a piece of paper and create 2 columns. In one column, write down those things that you're saying to yourself on the left. And then on the right column, write down evidence to the contrary. So, in the first column of things I currently say to myself, you get injured and you say, that's it, my season is over. In the other column, which is evidence to the contrary or alternative ways of thinking, you can say something like this: it's way too early to know this. I'll focus on having a strong end to the season, and added rest will help all of my other issues clear up. I'll be fresh and motivated when most other athletes are fatigued and getting burnt out. So do you see how that is kind of a different way of thinking about your injury? And it still gives you a way to verbally process and get out those negative thoughts while confronting it with the fact-finding behavior. So those are that's a little bit about the appraisal process and kind of assessing what an injury means to you, really the importance of that and how that impacts re-injury, and then 3 gremlins or problems that you might have in your primary appraisal process, and then how to deal with them. So that is what I have for you today. I hope that served you. Like I said before, I hope that this isn't relevant for you, because that means that you aren't injured. But if you get into endurance training long enough, you will encounter an injury. It's just bound to happen. And the key thing here that I'm learning and that I want to point out is it's not the actual injury. It's the thoughts and feelings that you have about the injury and the thoughts and feelings that you have about yourself and being able to deal with it. And I think that is really the most powerful thing, because that is even true with the way that we live our daily lives and the way that we approach everything that happens to us. It's not what happens to us, it's how we perceive what happens to us. And so that's my message for you today. I hope that served you, and I hope you all have an amazing day.